It was the sacrifice day, a hallowed day, the day of solemn processions and reverence for the god that kept the city prosperous, for a compensation. For some, the price would seem unacceptable. The lives of many and the entire city were at stake, however, so I considered it a steep fare that had to be contended with. Such was the ancient contract. It was sealed in clay and locked away in the Blue Temple, and had been kept there hidden from prying eyes for countless years. 10,000 drops of blessed oil, a holy flower, a gemstone, a living doling, and a man slain at the altar, whose soul was tasked with delivering these gifts to the god of the dead, and of the afterlife, and waves, and the sea, and all that dwelt in it, to Derdenuk, the depth begotten. The sea was calm on that day, and the sun shone unbothered, casting its sparkles generously across the tame waves, barely touched by foam. Not a sail in sight. Only the wide-winged birds calling from above, and the deep blue of Derdenuk's domain, and the cliffs awash with spray. The procession moved toward the cliffs through the city, followed by a throng of people. I rode in my chariot at the very head of it, holding a bow in my stretched-out hands. The bowl was adorned with waves and fishes and held a little sea of its own, glass and lapis beads arranged so as to resemble the waters, white and transparent on top, with the deep mesmerizing blue of lapis on the bottom. Behind me was a dancing covey of beautiful women in flowing dresses of the best linen the city tailors could cut. They were swaying and spinning, praising Derdenuk and their patroness, goddess Kuna. Long strings with the largest and loveliest pearls adorned their arms, wrapped around them like the tentacles of some ancient sea beast. Then there was a caravan of carts, pulled by 2 wreathed oxen and holding the offerings. In the first cart were 4 of the most venerated priests of the Blue Temple, holding the vessel of oil. They were whispering praises as we went. The second cart held my gardener, who cradled the rarest flower in his hands, a blazing red bell, striped with yellow and dotted with white. This flower blossomed only once a year, and there was only a single vine producing it in my garden. Behind the gardener sat my best jeweler, his legs crossed. In his hands, cupped over his head, was a large yellow jasper, polished to look like an egg of gold. Finally, the third cart carried a shaken and bleeding doylin, and a poor man, chosen by the cast of bones. His hands were bound behind his back and tied to a pole. Every now and then I would cast a pitying glance over my shoulder. I tried to lock eyes with him. He was but a farmer, and I wanted to stare deep within to guess the man's thoughts, and whether his soul was prepared to depart its mortal shell, as he joined the unfortunate ones. I would mourn him. Every year I made sure the families of those who were sacrificed received a suitable payment to dull the pain of loss. The longer we moved, the larger the crowd grew, and by the time we had reached the cliffs overlooking the sea, there wasn't enough space for a date to fall. That, however, was quite usual. Ancient tablets claimed that once on sacrifice days, Derdenuk himself would approach the cliffs, and his dreadful maelstrom would stretch from north to south as far as the eye could see, moving vast amounts of water. One, they said, felt like a fly among all the stars, so awe-inspiring and imposing was the sight. But they were ancient tablets. The patron god hadn't been seen at the shores of Kosh-Derdenuk for at least a century. The procession stopped. I disembarked and cast a long stare into the sea. The cliffs of Kosh-Derdenuk surely were created for poets to sing about them and for artisans to immortalize them in their masterpieces. When I was young, I traveled to many places, and so many magnificent sights not everyone's imagination was even capable of picturing. The disorienting wealth of Kamum's studded ziggurat, the sand-colored rings of Achrit's quarters, climbing a hill so tall one could see it from the desert, hovering overhead like one of Urgul's mirages, and even the warlike towers of Zedur, covered in pitch and shattered remains of the walls of cities Zedur had conquered. My beloved city, Kosh-Derdenuk, had nothing to boast of compared to its brother cities. We were a modest place, fed by trade and the gifts of the sea. We were peaceful, and my treasury had no trophies plundered in some distant lands. But our wealth was in another, primal nature. The sight of the cliffs of Kosh-Derdenuk, and the rolling sea stretching to the end of the world, and the lush, grassy knolls crawling around dotted wide by our goat herds, was to die for. I loved these cliffs, except for that one day in a year, the sacrifice day. The tranquility of the landscape didn't match the turmoil of my soul. The oxen were lightened of their burden, and the procession continued on foot, with me still at the head. Soon the head priest would take my place and orchestrate the ritual, but it was my task to lead my people down the narrow steps cut into the cliff face, leading to an altar, for now hidden behind the rugged rocks and sea spray. After the first bend of the staircase, it came into view, a flat platform of polished stone, supporting a boat also cut out of solid rock, with intricate carvings and designs upon its sides. The cliff behind it receded naturally, creating a domed, shallow cavity invisible from the top. From here, however, it looked as though a temple had been built by nature herself, lacking only perhaps its clergy. There, my best craftsmen had applied their tools, cutting even deeper into the cliff face. Vast masses of rock were removed to leave a column to stand in the middle of the cavity, naturally growing from the ground and into the top of the dome. It was a statue of Derdenuk the Depth-Begotten, who was an immense column of churning water, stirring the silt from the bottom of the sea and disturbing the surface with a maelstrom of incomprehensible might. In the middle of the column, a face was carved with an expression most indifferent. Nothing excited Derdenuk as he sucked in the souls of the dead, transporting them beyond the waters to the afterlife. Neither sin nor virtue made his face flinch or even wrinkle. The crude walls around the monument were covered almost entirely with pictures and cuneiform, telling tales of immortality, passage between worlds, seafaring, and the roaming wild force that Derdenuk was. The platform was built just high enough for the water to cover it but not overtake the stone boat at high tide, making it look as though the boat was about to sail away on sea foam. Such was the hour as we descended. The entire staircase was filled with people, from the bottom to the very top. The platform, however, was only reserved for me and my priests. We removed our sandals and stepped barefoot into the cold water. Our gifts were placed carefully into the boat, as well as the bound man. The head priest took charge. He touched my shoulder with a nod. He was ready. "Let's make it quick," I whispered to him. "First the sacrifice, then read the praise. Let's be done with the gruesome part." "Yes, my lord, as you wish." If during the procession I sought the farmer's glance, now I couldn't force my eyes away from the sea. I was now afraid to look, as I always had been every year. I felt his stare on my back, but I dared not answer it. Not everyone chosen for the sacrifice had stayed silent, and sometimes we had to gag the unfortunate victims. But this one hadn't dropped a word since he was put on a procession cart. And even when the sharp dagger of the priest dug into his flesh, he stayed silent. My own heart beat faster as I heard the rustle of robes and the shuffle of limbs behind me. I felt as though it was me who was being stabbed. I waited just a bit longer and then finally turned. The farmer's eyes had already rolled behind their lids, and crimson stained the white stone boat. The crowd stood also quiet. The only sounds around us were the mumble of the head priest, the bleating of the doling, and the crashing of the waves. We were all waiting for the head priest to finish his praise to Derdenuk. People rejoiced as his prayer ended. I, to the contrary, grew even more agitated. There was a feeling I can't put to words. I had been in its power since the moment I had risen with the sun. Something today was different. Somehow, this sacrifice procession felt distinct. My breath grew shorter. I gazed into the sea as the people began to ascend the staircase back to the cliff tops. I was waiting for the maelstrom to appear and twist the horizon. I was sure my priests felt the same, but were afraid to give it voice. There was the presence of the otherworldly in the air, like a suspended invisible bolt of lightning, tingling at the end of one's senses, teasing my very being. Do you think he will come today at last? The question itself fell upon me like lightning. I turned away from the sea and saw my head priest staring in that same direction. So I was right. He had felt it too. I'm not certain, I replied after a moment's contemplation. How can any of us be? But there is something out there. Maybe he will come after all, or give us a sign. The Blue Temple has been awaiting this. The priest shook his head slowly. We all feel it, the pressure in the air. Stars are low, birds fly low. And the sea, I added, is still today, though it has been raging for a while. The grass on the knolls billows with no wind at all. It's an omen. I could not help but agree. I began ascending the stairs. The only thing left to learn is whether the omen is good or otherwise. Time hadn't been particularly merciful to me, so when we finally reached the top of the staircase, I was quite winded. Some of the people went off to their homes to celebrate the day of sacrifice among their kin. Others stayed and lingered on the cliffs. They were watching the waves, covering their eyes from the sun. Some sat at the very edge, peering down at the stone boat. From this height it was the size of a toy, a white one smeared in red. If one were to listen closely to the wind, they would hear a very, very faint bleating. I too remained. It was a matter of ceremony. We were waiting for the sea to defy its tide and rise even higher and lick away the offerings we left for it below, for this is how it had always been. This sign that our sacrifice was sufficient, a sign of acceptance, of appeasement, was of importance to many, to me as well. My glance darted from the stone boat to the horizon and back. The offerings were still there, and the gentle waves beat rhythmically against the jagged rocks and reefs. The horizon was peaceful, and nothing disturbed the glittering blue of the sea. Derdenuk didn't come. I sighed. Deep within, I nursed a dream of seeing the god patron at least once in my life. Perhaps next year. Perhaps when the god is pleased with us. Suddenly, there was a rush of water, a surge of white and blue and green, though the tide was supposed to sit already at its highest point. People around me gasped and whispered among each other. They were pointing fingers, hungry to see the hint of the divine. Each year, this itch of theirs got its scratch. All the eyes were on the stone boat. I stared down as well, with the head priest at my side. I heard him mumble praises in a hushed voice. The water below reached the edges of the boat and spilled in. An invisible force began to spin the currents, and they turned into a noisy and foamy whirlpool consuming the offerings. First, the vessel of oil was knocked over and disappeared into the spray as the oil was sucked out. Then the bleating ceased. But after, I saw steam. Narrowing my eyes, I came closer to the edge of the cliff. The whirlpool was steaming like a hot meal in a bowl. "What is this?" the head priest uttered, clutching at his robes. "Maybe the sign we were waiting for," I replied. Then the water began to bubble and boil, and the steam from a thin veil grew thick like a cloud. "This," the priest looked me in the face, "this isn't supposed to happen. Something is not right." I licked my parched lips. "Did you read your praises right?" "I have been reciting them for decades. I know every word by heart." "Did we miss something?" I muttered to myself. "Or maybe the farmer was still alive." The head priest's face grew pale as stone when he considered my suggestion. "This can't be." His voice was coarse. I stabbed him through the heart, as we always do. He bled out before we left. He can't be alive. Maybe this sign means... But I was not meant to finish my thought. As I scrambled frantically for answers in my head, I leaned closer and closer to the edge, while the shroud of steam down at the sacrificial altar thickened so much it became impenetrable to the eye. All of a sudden, there was a shrill whistle, and a clapping noise so loud its echo travelled all across the cliff face, bouncing until it disappeared into the sea. I drew a short breath. The air I inhaled felt dry, similar to that of the desert. It burned my nostrils. Suddenly, a column of raging fire dispelled the steam. There were cries of terror all around me, but I was too slow to react. A shout of surprise was all I managed to produce. The pillar of fire snaked up the cliff face with dizzying speed. The people around recoiled. The heat scoured my face, and I smelled burning hair. It was as though the sea had spat out a furnace. I fell backward, and it knocked the breath out of my chest. Gasping, I tapped my beard as it was still smouldering. Then I turned over and looked about me. The head priest was running toward the city, and his robe was on fire. The poor and rich alike were fleeing and screaming. For a while I was just lying there, listening to my hastened breath and the beating of my heart. Then I crawled to the edge to take a look down. I will never forget the view that opened before me. Our offerings were gone, and so was the stone boat, blasted to pieces, that now littered the platform below. The water had receded completely, burying a part of the sea bottom. The sharp rocks sat lonely and wet, black and slick under the sun. But the water was what drew my attention first. It was still roiling, foaming, and burning. The sea was ablaze. How, I can't describe, nor can I understand. When I try to reason how water can burn, my head begins to spin. But I saw vast fields of fire, and they coughed out blue clouds of twisting smoke. That is simply impossible, I thought to myself. Impossible. I must be dreaming. But I knew I wasn't. As I took in the view, I noticed some movement at the border of my vision. I bent over the edge and looked down at the staircase. There was a slender figure cloaked in white, ascending. Something was wrong, I exhaled with no one to listen. Something was. I rushed to my feet and ran as fast as I could. The contract, the word rang in my head as I fled the cliffs. I must get to the contract. And so I turned a corner, elbowing through the crowds of screaming onlookers to try and reach the blue temple before the cloaked figure came to Kosh-Derdenuk. Somehow I was sure we were doomed if that happened. It took me much longer than usual to reach the street leading to the blue temple. The stream of people pushed, and it seemed there was no end to it. Strangely, I noted that they were running toward the cliffs now and not in the opposite way to the gates. No one cared for titles, and I was bounced around, kicked and shoved like a piece of driftwood tumbling in the tide. For a moment I thought I heard someone call out to me, but in the complete panic and cacophony around it was impossible to tell. Covering my head and bracing, I pushed a little closer to the temple when the call came again. "My lord," the voice insisted. "My lord, the gates." I turned. It took me a while, but I found a lone standing figure in the crush. It was one of my commanders, donning his shield and spear. He shouted at the top of his lungs, struggling to stay upright. "My lord, they are breaching the walls," he screamed. I didn't understand what in Derdenuk's name he was talking about. "The walls," I shouted back, confused. "Who? Are we being attacked?" "Yes, we are. Our gates will not hold for long." Who is attacking?" "I don't know. We were at the walls when the air began to thicken. They appeared from nowhere and massacred my guards. We're under siege." There was a cry for help, someone's desperate scream, and from the clear sky lightning came down and struck a home nearby, smashing it to bricks. Something caught fire, a billow of smoke blew past me. The crowd reeled away. At first, my commander tried to protect himself from them with his shield. Then he stumbled and fell. I caught a glimpse of him being trampled by dozens of feet. I paused. Besieged! There were no warnings, no sign of any attack. Where could they have come from? Who was it? Surely they couldn't simply appear from thin air like my commander suggested. I decided to continue toward the Blue Temple. Whatever answers I might find, I reasoned, would be given only by Derdenuk. That is, if he would grant us an audience. Finally, after what seemed to me like an eternity of terror, I reached the tall cerulean doors of the Blue Temple. There was no one to greet me inside and no priest around. The temple stood utterly deserted, the echo of the calamity outside wandering its halls and rooms. I lingered in the entrance hall for a breath's length. There was a tingling sensation in my left arm and I raised it to my eyes. Somehow, somewhere I had managed to cut it. The sleeve of my regal tunic was soaked in red, but that bothered me little. Without any more delay, I hastened to the inner sanctuary. It was a round room with no slit for the light to come in. The only light was the outline of the open door and the glow of oil lamps, half of which had been extinguished, emitting foul smoke. There was a low plinth in the middle, of the same stone as the sacrificial boat. Atop it sat a clay tablet, wrapped in cloth soaked in blessed oils, the ancient contract between the first settlers of the cliffs and Derdenuk, the depth-begotten. I rushed to it. My steps rang with echoes all around, from the floor tiled with black glazed bricks to the blue walls. I grabbed the contract and threw the cloth away. The tablet was chipped and worn. The very touch of it felt ancient. Cuneiform danced before my eyes, and I strained them in the half-light. I hurried out of the sanctuary to where it was brighter, and the noise of the catastrophe grew more prominent as I went. When I was young, I was trained in the ways of divination. The call of the depths, marked before me in clay, was fairly easy to read, and I required no head priest to plead with the patron of Kosh-Derdenuk, which I did without hesitation. I read the incantation aloud and squeezed my eyes, concentrating on my inner self, pushing out the screaming and crackling of lightning outside the temple. No answer. Nothing. Something? The most distant echo rebounded through the clay, and the contract quivered in my fingers as if Derdenuk granted no more than a grain of his attention. Panicking, I read the incantation again. Silence. Then a vague movement. Somewhere at the rim of inner sight. No, I must have imagined it. Again? Maybe. The noise was getting louder and louder, a new tone joined it, the drumming of feet, organized and full of intent. Soldiers were ascending the low white steps of the Blue Temple. I couldn't ignore it anymore and broke my concentration. Damnation! With the tablet in hand I hurried out and froze in place once I laid eyes upon the temple entrance. The figure in white, the one I had seen from the cliffs, stood there, barring my exit. The noises suddenly faded away. I thought it was my imagination. She was the most striking young woman this temple had ever had the honor of welcoming. Her relaxed exterior, her warm smile and open embrace didn't match the chaos that ruled beyond these walls. Mordu of Kosh-Derdenuk, she called my name. I flinched. No one in Kosh-Derdenuk addressed me this way aside from my mother when she was still with me. Ah, are you startled by your own name? Come closer, she continued with a nod. This is a lovely place your people have built. Who are you? I wheezed. I dared not take a single step forward. She was not of this world, this I knew for certain, and I was afraid of it. There was an unseen pulse coming from her white-clad figure, The same energy the contract radiated when Derdenuk gave me that sliver of attention. Oh, lay down this useless shard of old clay. Her eyes were half shut, as if with delight. Derdenuk won't heed you. I didn't obey. Quite the opposite, I clutched the contract even harder, secretly praying for Derdenuk to intervene. Who are you? I repeated, but she stood still and ignored my question. Whoever you are, it's not safe here. Don't you see what's going on outside? She threw a quick glance at the entrance over her shoulder. At first she seemed genuinely confused, but then I noticed a mocking smile dancing in the corner of her full lips. What's outside? She raised her thin brows. Let me through. As you wish, my lord. She stepped aside and gestured for me to pass. I tarried, for I didn't expect that answer. Then, my eyes firmly on the woman in white, I ran out. Into nothingness. The streets were peaceful, if deserted and hollow. There was not a living soul outside except for me. The sky was barren of clouds, and no birds dared show their wings. There were no attackers besieging the walls, nor were there any of the brave warriors of Kosh-Derdenuk. In shock, I looked at the house that had been split by lightning in front of my own eyes. It stood right there, without so much as a scratch. No screams, no wind, no crashing of the waves. Complete stillness. See? I swung around. She was slowly approaching me, her open arms pointing at the sky and the roofs of the city. Where are my people? I whispered. Back where they were, of course, was the reply. Am I, still in Kosh-Derdenuk? Yes and no. We are in Kosh-Derdenuk, but perhaps not the Kosh-Derdenuk you're used to. The closer she got, the larger she grew. At first, as she began to walk, she appeared to be as tall as me, with shoulders broad like those of an ox, and her white dress seemed to be growing with her. By the time she stood a pace away from me, she was a giant, towering over me like a mountain. The sun shifted in its heavenly home to make room for her. You asked me who I am. My name in your ape tongue would be Nuubat the Collector. Do you know this name? I took a step back and shook my head. It didn't sound familiar. I am, she continued, still growing, a goddess, and the new patroness of Kosh-Derdenuk. Goddess or not, Kosh-Derdenuk had pledged loyalty only to one divine being. I raised the contract like a shield. We are under Derdenuk's protection, and other gods and goddesses are revered but not praised in Kosh-Derdenuk, I replied with a voice of stone. We have struck a contract with the depth begotten, and we have been honoring it for centuries. Until today. She pointed her long finger at the clay tablet. First it cracked as if struck by a hammer. Then it was reduced to ash, and it slipped through my shaking fingers. I let out a shrill cry. No. I sagged to my knees and sank my fingers into what remained of the ancient contract, as if hoping to knead it back whole. But no matter how desperately I tried, what had been so completely destroyed couldn't be made right again. I felt tears flow down my cheeks. This was the end of Kosh-Derdenuk. Derdenuk wouldn't spare a brick. Derdenuk doesn't even remember your city exists. Her voice now rumbled like thunder. I raised my eyes and recoiled. She had shed her human form. Nuubat spanned the greater part of the sky, her incredible being growing out of the horizon. She had no face and no body. Her countenance was ceaselessly changing, from one animal muzzle to some snout and to the next creature I didn't know the name of, morphing into one another in the span of a single breath. Something like an arm melted together with a claw and a hoof pointed at me from up high. Derdenuk roams his sea, and that is all he ever cares about. He cares little for sacrifices or praise, and even less does he care for your sorry mortal lives. He's content to send your pitiful souls to the afterlife, and he needs nothing more. But I am not the same. The words echoed through my body, forcing me to shake in awe. You thought your sacrifices were appeasing the depth-begotten. For several years it was me who received your pittance. Your city was left without guidance, and its shadow tumbled through the universe screaming for a master. I heard and answered that call, so pledge yourself to me. I shut my eyes and covered my head, for her voice was pounding and the ground was quaking with each word. I clenched my teeth. Everything inside me turned upside down. So all this time we were sending our offerings to our goddess we didn't even know the name of. I forced myself to reply, but it came out as a pathetic stutter. I can't speak for all my people. We can begin with just your pledge, for now. Besides, you are their leader, and you violated your contract. Someone has to answer for that, and who's a better fit than the Lugo himself? The shaking ceased, and her words turned into a sweet whisper that snaked into my ears. With a gasp, I opened my eyes to see the beautiful woman standing next to me again, her hand on my shoulder in a soothing gesture. Violated? So there was something wrong with the offerings then? Oh yes, she said. Your offering of oil was 3 drops short. A grave chill came over me. I sat there in a daze, my mouth agape. 3 drops. That was all I could say. Yes, Derdenuk wouldn't even have noticed certainly, but I do. The fate of your beloved city is in your hands now. Pledge yourself to me, Mordu, and have the punishment halted. Reject me, and see your people wiped out by foreign armies, and your homes leveled by lightning. Of course she knew my answer beforehand. How could I say no to such a demand? I wouldn't let so many people down and bargain their lives for my pride or Derdenuk's ire. Nuubat was a goddess, after all. I knew her threats were true. So, she continued, what is your answer? Do you want to save your city and its people? I slowly rose to my feet and bowed my head in resignation. I pledge myself to you, Nuubat, and I do it for them. Good. All demise is certain, in time, but you can, and just did, postpone the inevitable. The Lugo of Kosh-Derdenuk pledges himself to my service. Then the city has fully slipped from under the control of the depth-begotten, no? Wouldn't you say, she locked her hands behind her back, that the name Kosh-Nuubat is more appropriate? Very well. As soon as you bring me back, I'll declare the new name to the people. I may return you. There was a guileful glint in the corner of her eye. Or I may not. Yet. There are still many things we should discuss. There are armies at our gates, I pleaded with my new mistress. Please, at least help us defeat them. The city is under your protection, is it not? What is the point in having a flock if it's being slaughtered by predators? The last thing I saw before the world faltered was her cunning smile. Then her face was marred with beastly aspects once again. Then the sky turned green, then red, then assumed a color I couldn't describe. Everything around me contorted and merged together into an impossible mass of space and matter, swirling and changing, and then faded to impenetrable darkness as I lost and regained consciousness. Then, in a heartbeat, the world dawned back. When my head stopped spinning, I found myself on the ground amid the crowd outside the Blue Temple. But the crowd stood still, like a collection of eerie statues. There was no sound in this plane of existence, nor was there any wind or any sense of touch. I couldn't feel the dust I was treading. I touched my tunic to find it didn't return the touch. Sunlight hung solid in the air. People around me, some faces even recognizable, froze still. I was imprisoned with them, in a single shred of time. Yet I could move, and I breathed. It was one of Nuubat's tricks. In her human form, she glided between motionless figures several paces away from me. "They are all alive, Lugu." She pointed at me from behind some artisan's shoulder. "Only I decide whether they should succumb or persist. That decision rests on whether you can satisfy me. A human mind can't comprehend divine intelligence. Peering into the mind of a god or goddess is an insurmountable task for a regular man. Even if I could read thoughts, each thought of a divine being is as heavy as a mountain, as deep as the sea, and as vast as the sands of the desert. I saw clearly that she was leading me on, playing with me as with a morsel in a bowl, prodding me to ask what it was that would satisfy her. I couldn't even begin to guess what a mortal could offer a goddess save for praise. Optimistically, I hoped she would ask for the 3 drops we had missed. I knew this to be false, however. "How can I satisfy you? You can cast lightning, create armies out of nothing, erase cities, topple other gods. What can a mortal man do, even if he's a Lugu?" "We will test just that." And then the world buckled and folded unto itself one more time. I felt my body jerk up into the air through the petrified sunlight. When my feet found solid ground again, I stood in complete white emptiness. There was no earth, no sky, nothing but myself and Nuubat, resting a couple of steps across. I tried to take a timid step forward. The sensation was strange. I could feel the support under my sandal, yet as far as my eye could see below, there was just a never-ending emptiness of white. Nuubat spoke. "I am the patroness of wild beasts and of magic. But first I am a collector. Your rarest flowers, although a nice offering, are common in comparison with what my collection has to boast. Your precious stones are mere pebbles in the shadow of what I can show. But you, Mordu, do have something that might be of interest to me. And this is what I want. If you have it, that will be your price, and we will strike a new contract. And what will we get in return? My protection, my patronage, prosperity, wisdom, and knowledge. Then ask if I own it. It will be yours. First," she wagged her finger, "we need to test if you can give it." Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. Consider subscribing to my channel. You can also find the text version of the story on my Substack. The link is in the description. Until next time.